In the middle of the 16-bit generation, a Castlevania game hit the market that passed by most international players, but would ultimately serve as an important foundation for the series' new direction. When director Toru Hagihara started development on this important title, the focus of the series was still on Simon Belmont. The 16-bit entries that had hit the market or were in production at that point were all retelling his original adventure. Hagihara strayed from these conventions under the new title Akumajo Dracula X, Rondo of Blood. Coming fresh from directing the second Castlevania for the Game Boy, Hagihara assembled a crew and started conceptualizing their new game to appear on NEC's PC Engine console. They naturally chose the CD-ROM format, as it had become the leading storage media for the PC Engine in 1992. Their new lead character, Richter Belmont, would inherit the series' classic control scheme, but with a few extra flourishes. The new backflip allowed him to quickly evade the various thrust attacks. Richter could also unleash a devastating special attack in return for a portion of hearts. Thanks to the new swap system, accidentally replacing your sub-weapon was a thing of the past. The most substantial change came in the form of a new and unlikely vampire hunter, the 12-year-old girl Maria Renard. Being an offshoot to the main series, the developers had a great deal of freedom to explore a different tone. Out of 3 conceptualized extra playable characters, Maria was the one that remained when the game entered production. She had animal friends and her magical powers to slay Dracula's minions. With her double jump and responsive controls, she was a creative way of including an easy mode. The player could unlock her in the second stage, which was designed in such a way that they would naturally discover how to free her. Maria's vastly different moves and attacks actually resulted in many headaches for the team, as they ran into bugs and glitches frequently. Besides taking on the role of director, Toru Hagihara was also responsible for the main programming and managed the schedule during the entire development. He had a playful sense of humor, which was reflected in the game's overall lighter tone. The art team decided to depart from the look of the preceding 16-bit releases in the franchise, adding anime-styled cutscenes and making use of a more saturated color palette. As the oldest console of its generation, the PC Engine still packed quite a punch. Like the Mega Drive, it used a 9-bit notation to define its colors, 3 bits per color channel, making for a total number of 512 unique colors the system could produce. Where it set itself apart from Sega's console was the sheer number of palettes developers could fill with those 512 colors. With 32 palettes available for on-screen artwork, sprites and background tiles could more easily have their own dedicated 16-color palette. The console's video chip only supported a single background plane, but this limitation was worked around in the game using all the tricks in the book. The focus of the Konami team was on their home market, since the PC Engine console had failed to replicate its success internationally. In some regards, this gave the art team greater freedom when designing monsters, as nudity and religious symbols were still highly censored in the West at that point. Among the art team was a sprite artist, talented in the field of animation. He was able to push the quality up a notch, a fine example being Maria's fluid run cycle. In addition, all bosses had their own unique entry animation. Implementing the enemy attack patterns was the job of a young programmer who happened to be an avid gamer himself. In his enthusiasm, he'd given them aggressive attack patterns that had to be toned down. For instance, the bosses had a desperation attack that could initially kill the player. The move remained in the final build, but was no longer lethal. Boss battles remained challenging, but the programmers had to demonstrate to the rest of the team that they were beatable without taking a hit. For the game's cutscenes, the art department inside Konami delivered paintings and hand-drawn character frames. They were subsequently digitized and adapted to the console limitations. Shots were further animated with the stock background and sprite functionality of the console. One of the staples of the series is without any doubt its standout soundtrack. By this point, compositions like Vampire Killer, The Beginning, and Bloody Tears were already regarded as quintessential tracks and would be arranged for Rondo of Blood. Akira Soji was in charge of the music and sound effects and composed the new signature track, Divine Bloodlines. Motoaki Furukawa, founder of Konami's famed in-house band, was brought in to lend his guitar skills to this opening track. Akira assigned 3 fellow Konami composers to the project. Together, they delivered a rich blend of arrangements and new tracks that would have a lasting impact on the franchise, not least of which being The Prayer for the file selection screen.
Dracula, der Fürst der Finsternis, Herr des Teufelsschlosses, ist auferstanden.
The German language happened to be of interest to Akira, and he thought it would be fitting for the game's introduction. In addition, Richter was named after a German conductor. Dialogue for the game's cutscenes was recorded in a professional recording studio by trained voice talent.
Belmondo no shison yo, mata ao!
Casting the right talent for both the cutscenes and the in-game samples was quite the challenge. The audio team listened meticulously to sample CDs provided by casting agencies to find the fitting talent. For the in-game samples, Akira mostly relied on his friends and Konami employees. He ultimately found the right candidates in 2 new recruits to the audio team and a salaryman. A conference room was converted to a temporary recording studio where the Konami employees would deliver the monster screams for the game. Puzzled by the strange noises coming from the room, a curious receptionist came through at one point to see what on earth was going on. Akumajo Dracula X Rondo of Blood would be packed with secrets and Easter eggs and showcase the attention to detail expected from a top Konami product. Using the massive storage capacity available, they realized their concept to greatly expand replayability. During a typical first run through the game, the player would only experience half of what it would have to offer. By including a clear percentage at the file selection screen, they would be encouraged to find the alternative stages and rescue the trapped villagers. All changes, both large and small, resulted in a fresh take within the expected Castlevania game structure. The effort by the developers was commended as it became one of the most beloved games in the series. Shortly after its release, rumors of Castlevania V for the Super Nintendo started to surface in the media. It would ultimately hit the market as an adaptation of Rondo of Blood in 1995, handled by a separate development team. By this point, the bar for console graphics had been raised significantly. The team at Konami went for a hand-drawn style for the backdrops, but in return had to scale down on the amount of content in the game. Despite this shortcoming and the slow gameplay, it turned out to be a solid but commercially failing adaptation. While Rondo of Blood was in development, the Mega Drive team had followed their own vision, loosely tying the series to the Bram Stoker novel. Each of the 16-bit console entries was helmed by a different director and had some overlap in development, leading to 3 unique installments. Programmer Koji Igarashi was eager to get actively involved in the franchise himself. As a fan of the series, he hung out with the Rondo of Blood team in his after hours and helped with debugging. After delivering a highly successful dating sim, he expressed his interest in being assigned to a follow-up to the Mega Drive entry. For the remainder of 1994, a small team conceptualized this new chapter to appear on Sega's 32X add-on. Meanwhile, gaming was gearing up for the next generation. Many contenders were fighting for their own piece of the market. At the start of 1994, Konami had already signed up as a third-party developer for Sony's anticipated machine. Konami's extensive R&D division was hard at work on tools and code libraries. The company had a multi-platform strategy, porting games to a range of systems. Tools and contracts for the PlayStation were finished first, and thus Konami's initial next-gen games would be built around its hardware. Over at the 32X Castlevania team, the project went through major changes. It shifted from a tie-in to the Mega Drive entry to a continuation of Rondo of Blood. The target platform would also change, as the 32X project was cancelled but reignited for the PlayStation. Scenario writer and programmer Koji Igarashi remained involved and joined with Akumajo Dracula X director Toru Hagihara. Helped by the core team of this PC Engine release, they proposed a game plan that would take the Dracula X series even further from the established formula. Rondo of Blood already had a sprinkling of exploration elements, but in the sequel, those would take center stage. Most of the team members were fans of the action-adventure genre, especially The Legend of Zelda. The adventure style fit with the desire to break from the challenging gameplay and allow players of all skill levels to have an enjoyable and lengthy experience. However, management questioned if the fan base would be accepting of such dramatic change. Super Castlevania IV had been the last commercial mega hit. Over the years, the brand was starting to rely on its strong fan base. It was in Castlevania II: Simon's Quest that the developers found some reassurance. This 8-bit title had already proven that there was once an audience accepting of an exploration-focused entry into the franchise, and thus helped to convince management of their idea. The next substantial change to the game would be the protagonist. Igarashi had explored various storylines while working on the 32X project. One idea that had survived was to swap the role of the Belmonts by turning them into an adversary. They felt that, in contrast to the muscled, whip-wielding Belmonts, a more elegant figure should take the lead, preferably a vampire. It would be ideal for the adventure gameplay, as being able to use a wide array of weapons and powers would make the upgrade journey more exciting for the player. The perfect candidate was a side character from Castlevania III, Alucard. Being the son of the human, Lisa, and Prince of Darkness, Dracula, Alucard could harness the powers of light and dark. He could therefore wield holy sub-weapons like the Belmonts, but also use the power of darkness for magic attacks, and to transform into creatures of the night. This appealed to the development team as they explored the idea for an alignment system in the game, whereby the ending would depend on usage of dark or light attacks in a playthrough. The character Alucard would make for a more dramatic story in which the tragic hero must confront his father. The 1992 blockbuster Bram Stoker's Dracula was the inspiration to add more depth to the personality of Dracula. The film showed the strong bond to his wife, and her death being the catalyst for his hatred towards humanity. The new Castlevania would take these story cues and pick up the storyline 5 years after the events of Dracula X. Maria Renard set out to search for the missing Richter Belmont, while Alucard mysteriously awoke from his supposed eternal slumber. With the core goals outlined, a small group of programmers and artists started production on this extensive game. They were part of CS5, one of the 6 divisions inside Konami Tokyo. They thought their concept lent itself best to traditional 2D gameplay, taking into account the limited knowledge of 3D on their team and the huge number of enemies planned. The original Dracula X could therefore serve as a strong foundation for the crew, not least for the gameplay. Project leads Hagihara and Igarashi would do a substantial amount of the coding. The PlayStation hardware was designed for 3D gameplay first and foremost. Gone was the traditional hardware support to scroll 2D background planes. Developers of traditional 2D games would mostly rely on the console's ability to draw 2D flat rectangles outside the 3D system. Symphony of the Night, however, used a mixture of 2D and 3D primitives. All the 3D objects on the PlayStation are made up of 3-sided polygons. The console had a special function to position 2 polygons next to each other and so form a quad. These were textured to display characters and objects for Castlevania. Since they were part of the 3D system, they could fully use the rotation and scale functionality in addition to transparency effects. Aside from quads, they also used the rectangle primitive for various particle effects. The PlayStation's GPU could draw a 2D shape much faster than polygons, although they lacked any 3D functionality. As for the backgrounds, the programmers emulated the tile system from the 16-bit generation, placing 16x16 flat rectangles in a grid. Quads were used to enrich the backgrounds with objects, free from a grid system. Quads were further used for animated background elements. Some were placed in perspective for a true 3D effect. With this mixture of 2D and 3D elements, the areas didn't really exist as a complete 3D environment. Their depth was simply created by the order that rectangles or polygons were sent to the GPU to render. The resourcefulness of the programmers really came to the fore in some scenes. For example, during the second phase of the prologue battle scene, the background composed of 2D rectangles is replaced with a background made of quads that could be fully rotated. To hide the transition, they implemented a little shake effect. Although the engine ended up using more CPU power than they anticipated, the clever optimized coding resulted in a smooth engine that could display a large number of objects on screen at once. The enemy Granfaloon was designed as a showcase to display its potential. While Koji Igarashi wrote the storyline, character designer Furukawa was responsible for the dialogue. Key scenes were storyboarded, and the layout of the entire castle was sketched beforehand. In order to test the layouts while the pixel art was still in development, they made use of placeholder blocks. To boost performance, the game runs in a low resolution and uses a low bit depth color mode. This allowed the developers to maximize the amount of artwork that could be stored in the video memory. In the low color modes, the tilesets simply linked to palettes, like they did in the previous console generations. However, each tileset could have their own palette that could be filled from millions of colors. Backgrounds could therefore have a rich textured look and use colors that a console like the PC Engine simply could not display. Another neat feature of the PlayStation was to shift the brightness of tiles freely across the screen to replicate shading effects without any additional memory usage. As the artists worked on the pixel art, the rooms started to become alive in their minds. With the game's concept solidified early on, individual members had a great deal of freedom to shape their work and implement all kinds of details and secrets. Toru Hagihara himself also added his ideas to bring the castle to life. He was also able to cleverly hide most of the loading interruptions with a special hallway. In this room, the music stream stops, and thus new texture pages could be loaded from disk while the player passes through the hallway. The extensive castle required a cast of enemies far beyond the number of the previous entries. Luckily, they were able to transfer the majority of enemies from Rondo of Blood pixel perfectly, as they chose to use the same resolution for characters. The animator responsible for these original sprites continued his involvement, making it easier to keep a consistent style among enemies and add additional animation frames. The animator also managed to portray Alucard's elegance through his smooth run cycle. The game's bestiary would include almost 150 enemies, ranging from mythological monsters to characters from The Wizard of Oz. All the crew's effort led to some playable areas by the end of 1995. After this kickstart, some staff members had to temporarily abandon the project to focus on other matters, leaving the artist to continue independently. It was therefore uncertain if the project would be ready for the announced summer of 1996 deadline. With the new protagonist came the desire to break from the visual style of characters from the preceding games. To broaden their horizons, the crew started browsing in bookstores and researching the artists behind the covers that seemed fitting for their game.
What can I do for you?
Out of the candidates, they picked Ayami Kojima, a freelance manga illustrator in the horror action genre. Her distinct style of blending beauty, darkness, and elegance matched the new look that they were aiming for. Ayami Kojima had her own personal process, using a variety of tools and techniques. After the initial discussion of the character traits with the directors, she would make sketches using Conte crayons and define darker shadows with Indian ink. A signature style is the usage of modeling paste applied with a palette knife to create texture. Color was an important aspect for discussion. Each character has a strikingly different key color, according to their personality. After applying acrylic paints for the base colors, the artwork would still undergo numerous touch-ups, from emphasizing highlights and applying metallic paints to smudging the paint for soft gradients and glows. While the cover art for previous titles often had to be delivered in a matter of days, Ayami Kojima was involved at a much earlier stage of production, which fit her dedicated method and pacing to set the new style for the series. The finished work greatly helped to shape the characters in the minds of players and added a more mature look compared to its predecessor. Kojima's art style and the richly detailed backgrounds set an unmatched atmosphere for the game. Composer Michiru Yamane would further enhance it with a stellar soundtrack. Like the other artists involved, the directors gave her a great deal of freedom. The visuals would be a driving factor for the musical genre of a given stage. The score incorporates a diversity of elements from rock to jazz to orchestral music. Igarashi in particular was open to the different styles that had not yet been incorporated into the series. Most of the compositions were done in audio software packages like Logic and Pro Tools to create the orchestral instrumental sound. A traditional trained singer and 2 guitarists were brought on board to further deepen the score. The guitar-driven track Wandering Ghost is a fine example. When the compact disc formats like CD digital audio and CDI were first defined, their specifications were published in color-coded books. Red Book, being the standard for regular audio CDs, was used to store the music for the first Dracula X game. The PlayStation supported the compressed XA audio format, first defined in the Green Book that specified CDI. Using this compressed format extended the amount of music that could be stored on the disc. The hardware had integrated support to stream and decompress it in real time. In a few instances, game data had to be loaded from disk, and thus the music couldn't be streamed. In those cases, the music was synthesized by the PlayStation's sound chip using samples loaded in the audio RAM. To ready themselves for the new generation of multimedia gaming, Konami brought on Rika Muranaka, a bilingual young producer with many connections in the US recording industry, and thus perfect for Konami's desire to add songs with international appeal. Her first job was to produce a pop ballad for Castlevania's ending credits. Muranaka flew over to LA and met up with lyricist Tony Haynes. Together, they wrote the pop-soul ballad I Am the Wind, mixed at Capitol Recording Studio in Los Angeles, featuring the talents of renowned jazz musicians like Gerald Albright. For the vocalist, Muranaka turned to one of her friends, Cynthia Harrell, whose voice she deemed fitting for the song. I Am the Wind was a humble beginning to Muranaka's influence in bringing an international sound to Konami's biggest franchises. Years later, she would call again upon the talents of Cynthia Harrell for the James Bond-esque Snake Eater theme. At the dawn of the 32-bit generation, CGI was no longer only for a small group of pioneering companies. It was to be expected from game developers to include some form of multimedia in their projects for a contemporary feel. Up until this point, the senior artist inside Konami Tokyo had little to no experience with 3D and video editing packages. It was an opportunity for young arts graduates to enter the field and quickly rise through the ranks. Metal Gear Solid 3 cinematic producer Ken Imaizumi had his humble start with the cutscenes for Symphony of the Night. He was involved in the cinematics for most early PS1 releases and worked in a separate department. As 1996 rolled on, Dracula's castle started to be fully implemented and dialogue was recorded. The new build was showcased on a promo VHS tape, along with the first footage of a completely different Castlevania for the N64, developed in Kobe. Toru Hagihara, now head of Konami's CS5 division, handed over the reins to Koji Igarashi, who would continue with a core group of 8. It had been the developers' intent to have the player beat the game first by defeating Richter Belmont. Death's encounter early on was a scene to place question marks in the player's head, as both this evil servant and the equipment he took from Alucard were hidden deep within the game. In their search to add more content for the players, they came up with the idea to add a reversed castle. The team was able to secure some more development time to implement it, pushing the release to 1997. After being in development for almost 2.5 years, several artists joined for the final stretch of production. The schedule remained intense, with some people still at work on New Year's Eve. The game code ballooned, to the point that it took an hour to compile a new build, which led to further hardships. During the final weeks, they had to decide which, from the list of suggested features, to implement. An idea to include Alucard's room and have the player decorate it throughout the game was abandoned, and so was the idea to include more characters like Elizabeth Bartley. However, Familiars and the cutscene with Alucard's mother was successfully realized right before the deadline. One thing that slipped through production was the temp designs of the game's menus. They forgot to give them a proper design treatment, and thus the menus created by the programmer ended up in the final product. While in the middle of such a hectic work schedule, the team had no sense of how all their changes to the franchise would ultimately be received by the fans. After delivering the final build for the Japanese market, they took some well-deserved time off. Meanwhile, management had decided to push its international launch forward. What followed was a big rush to have it revoiced and translated for the Western release. Upon its launch, Symphony of the Night was surrounded by the latest 3D spectacle. Nevertheless, players around the world embraced its more traditional gameplay. Word of the game's extensive castle and immersive atmosphere quickly spread, and most fans welcomed the new direction. It went on to become a commercial hit in most markets, matching the success of the first Castlevania. On top of that, the charged manufacturing and royalty cost for a PlayStation disc were considerably lower than that of a typical Nintendo cartridge. In line with Konami's multi-platform strategy, a Saturn port would ultimately hit the market as well, developed by their Nagoya office, who did their best to adapt the engine designed for the PlayStation to the complex architecture of the Saturn. The 32-bit generation was a true turning point in gaming history, and so was Symphony of the Night in many ways. While designed as an offshoot to the main series, Symphony of the Night would spawn a range of similarly structured games, and so became the leading template for Castlevania. For the two main artists of the Dracula X games, it had been one of the final projects before leaving the games industry entirely, as pixel art started to fall out of fashion. In contrast, for crew members involved in the multimedia aspect, it had been a boost to their career. Symphony of the Night marked a moment in gaming history where some of the greatest talents in programming, art, and music came together and were granted the time and freedom to make their extensive state-of-the-art 2D game in a 3D market. Decades later, their effort would keep inspiring a whole new generation of game developers, and so it not only became a significant game for the series, but for the whole 2D action-adventure genre.